What if I told you that one of the greatest armies in European history was destroyed not by a brilliant strategic maneuver, but by simple mud and a piece of wood? The Battle of Agincourt was an event that completely changed the perception of war, honor, and chivalry, showing that technology and discipline can overcome any brute force. It was a battle in which 5,000 exhausted, sick, and starving men faced 30,000 of France's best warriors, clad in shining steel. It seemed that the outcome was predetermined by fate itself, and all the English king could do was pray for a quick death for his soldiers. But history decided otherwise, turning the French numerical superiority into their main weakness and trap. Two eras collided on this battlefield: the passing era of brilliant but unwieldy knighthood, and the dawning era of professional infantry. We are used to thinking that the one with more people and a richer treasury wins, but Agincourt proved that overconfidence kills more surely than the enemy's sword. Watch the video to the end to find out how English archers were able to stop the cream of the French nobility, and what role the usual autumn weather played in this. What if I told you that this entire bloody campaign was launched solely so that one man could prove his right to the crown? Henry V ascended the English throne as a young and ambitious ruler, whose past was far from flawless and raised questions among the nobility. It was vital for him to unite a fragmented country around a common goal, and war with a long-standing rival was ideal for this. France at that time was itself torn apart by internal conflicts, presenting a tempting target for any determined conqueror. Henry understood perfectly well that a small, victorious war would consolidate his power more reliably than any decrees or internal reforms. He claimed the French throne, citing old dynastic ties that many in Europe considered controversial and far-fetched. It was a bold diplomatic challenge, to which the French court, mired in intrigue, responded with criminal slowness and arrogance. Henry began preparing for the invasion with meticulous care, pawning his jewels to hire ships and gather provisions. He understood that he was risking everything. Defeat would mean not only the loss of his army, but also the end of his dynasty. All of England sprang into action, with smithies working day and night to produce thousands of arrows and arrowheads. The army that Henry assembled was not a simple feudal militia, but a group of professionals who had signed contracts for service. The king did not rely on heavy cavalry, as was customary, but on mobile units of archers, which were cheaper but more effective in defense. This decision, dictated more by economics than strategy, would later become a key factor in victory. Henry personally oversaw the recruitment of men, demanding strict discipline and obedience, which was rare for medieval armies. He wanted to create a unified mechanism that would work smoothly, even in the most difficult conditions of a foreign land. The landing in Normandy was successful, but it immediately became clear that it would not be an easy walk to Paris. The French avoided a general battle, preferring a scorched earth tactic and small skirmishes to wear down the enemy. Henry needed a resounding conquest, a symbol of his power, and he chose the port city of Harfleur as his first target. This decision seemed logical from a logistical point of view, but it almost cost him the entire campaign at the very beginning. The king was confident of a quick victory, but the city walls proved stronger and the defenders more stubborn than the English engineers had anticipated. The siege dragged on, and time began to work against the English army, which was dwindling with each passing day. Resources, calculated for a quick campaign, were rapidly running out, and food supplies were irregular and scarce. The soldiers began to grumble, realizing that instead of glorious battles, they would face starvation under the walls of a foreign city. Henry, however, remained adamant, demonstrating iron will and demanding that the siege guns continue to bombard the walls. He personally visited the posts, encouraging the men and reminding them of the rich spoils that awaited them inside. But the main enemy of the English was not French swords, but an invisible killer that always accompanies large gatherings of people in unsanitary conditions. Disease began to mow down the ranks of the invaders faster than enemy arrows, turning the camp into a huge infirmary. Dysentery spared neither simple archers nor noble lords, equalizing everyone in suffering and helplessness. The army was melting away before their eyes, losing its combat effectiveness, and even the capture of Harfleur no longer seemed such a great victory. Henry found himself trapped by his own ambitions, with a city in his hands but no army capable of continuing the conquest. When the city finally fell, the king faced a difficult choice: return to England, acknowledging the failure of his plans, or risk everything. Returning home with a pitiful handful of survivors and one captured city would look like defeat in the eyes of Parliament. Henry understood that his authority would not withstand such a blow, and decided to go all in, continuing his march through enemy territory. It was the decision of a gambler who, having lost half his fortune, bets the rest on zero in the hope of winning it back. He announced a march to Calais, the English stronghold in northern France, from where he would sail home in honor. This march was to be a show of force, a daring passage through the French king's domain, a slap in the face to the entire French knighthood. Henry left a garrison in Harfleur and took with him only the most resilient soldiers, capable of moving quickly and lightly. He ordered the wagons, excess equipment, and even part of the artillery to be abandoned in order to increase the speed of movement. Soldiers were allowed to take only what they could carry and 8 days' worth of food. It was a desperate move that turned the army into a flying squad, cut off from supply lines and assistance. The risk was enormous because the French army, having finally gathered its forces, had already begun to converge to intercept the insolent invaders. Henry knew that he was being watched, that his every move was being tracked by enemy scouts. But he believed in his luck and in the discipline of his men, hardened by battle and deprivation. The king bet on speed and surprise, hoping to reach Calais before the French could organize a blockade. Do you think this decision was a display of brilliant courage or reckless madness bordering on suicide? Write your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how nature can be a more terrifying enemy than an armed army? The march to Calais, which was planned as a quick week-long journey, turned into a real-life nightmare for the English soldiers. The autumn weather in France had taken a turn for the worse, and endless torrential rains turned the roads into an impassable mess of mud. People walked knee-deep in water, soaked to the skin, shivering from the cold and the piercing wind. Every step was difficult, and the weight of weapons and armor seemed twice as heavy due to the clay that had stuck to them. The food supplies, intended to last 8 days, ran out much earlier, and the soldiers were forced to search for food in the ravaged lands. The local population hid their supplies or stole livestock, leaving the English with only empty barns and scorched fields. Hunger became a constant companion of the army, forcing people to eat berries, roots, and even the raw meat of fallen horses. Discipline was maintained only by fear of the king and the understanding that it was impossible to survive alone in enemy territory. Henry forbade looting on pain of death, trying to maintain at least some semblance of order. The French, knowing the English route, acted competently and ruthlessly, using tactics to block crossings. They destroyed bridges over rivers, forcing Henry's exhausted army to make huge detours in search of fords. Every extra kilometer of travel took away precious strength and time, allowing the main French army to close in. The English found themselves trapped between the swollen Somme River and their pursuing enemy, like a wolf cornered by flags. The situation became critical, and rumors of imminent doom began to spread among the soldiers. Henry maneuvered, trying to outwit the enemy by making false attacks and abruptly changing the direction of the column's movement. He personally conducted reconnaissance, risking his life, and looked for any opportunity to cross to the other side. One such place was found by a miracle, an old dilapidated causeway across the marshes, which the French had apparently forgotten about. The English crossed in complete silence, waist-deep in icy water, passing weapons from hand to hand. It was a moment of incredible tension, when any mistake could lead to the discovery and destruction of the entire army at the crossing. As soon as the English reached the other side, they realized that their maneuver had only delayed, but not prevented, the inevitable. French heralds, messengers of knightly honor, arrived at Henry's camp with an official challenge to battle. They behaved with deliberate arrogance, confident in the overwhelming superiority of their masters over a bunch of ragged rebels. For the French nobility, the upcoming battle was seen not as a war, but as a grand hunt for a cornered beast. Henry accepted the challenge calmly, realizing that there was nowhere left to run and that the time for diplomacy was over. The army continued its march, but now the soldiers knew that what awaited them ahead was not the salvation of Calais, but a wall of French spears. Morale wavered, but the presence of the king, who shared all the hardships of the journey with his simple soldiers, prevented panic from taking hold. Henry slept on the bare ground, ate the same meager food, and walked on foot, saving the strength of his war horse. He became not just a monarch to his people, but a leader whom they were ready to follow even to hell. This unity between the king and the army became the invisible backbone that kept the army from falling apart. Meanwhile, the French army was growing, with troops from all corners of the kingdom joining in to take part in the defeat. Dukes, counts, and barons brought not only weapons, but also ceremonial armor, preparing for triumph. They were so confident of victory that they began dividing up the noble English prisoners and setting ransoms for them in advance. Their camp was filled with an atmosphere of celebration, feasting, and knightly tournaments, so inappropriate in the face of war. The French forgot the main rule of war: never underestimate an enemy who has nothing to lose. The English, on the other hand, moved in gloomy silence, saving every word and every movement to conserve what little energy they had left. They understood that their only chance was discipline and faith in their weapon, the longbow. The archers guarded their bows and strings more carefully than their own lives, hiding them from the damp under their clothes. Everyone knew their place in the ranks and their task, because the lives of everyone depended on coordinated action. It was an army of professionals, driven into a corner, and therefore twice as dangerous. Finally, scouts reported that the road to Calais was blocked by a huge army stationed near the castle of Agincourt. The field that the French had chosen for battle was a narrow space between two dense forests. It was the only passage, and the English had to fight their way through it or die on the spot. Henry stopped the army and ordered them to prepare for the night, knowing that the fate of England would be decided tomorrow. A heavy anticipation hung in the air, saturated with the smell of rain and fear. In the next chapter, you will learn how one sleepless night can change the outcome of a battle even before the first sword is struck, and why silence is more frightening than noise. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of knightly valor? The night before the Battle of Agincourt was a vivid illustration of how differently the two armies viewed the upcoming event. The French camp, huge and brightly lit by thousands of bonfires, resembled a fair or a gathering of nobles. The noise, laughter, clinking of cups, and loud arguments about who would attack first could be heard for miles around. The French knights, fired up by wine and the anticipation of easy glory, even played dice to see who would capture King Henry himself. For the French nobility, war was a ritual, a way to demonstrate their prowess and obtain a rich ransom for prisoners. They did not perceive English archers as a serious threat, considering them rabble unworthy of fighting noble lords. This caste arrogance blinded them, preventing them from assessing the real situation and the characteristics of the terrain. The command was fragmented. Each noble lord considered himself the leader and did not want to obey general orders. In this chaos of ambition, all strategy was lost, giving way to personal vanity. In the English camp, located just a kilometer away, there was a completely different, deathly silence. Henry forbade any noise under penalty of immediate cutting off of the ears, and this cruel order was obeyed without question. The English understood that their situation was desperate, and instead of drinking, they prepared their weapons and prayed. Priests confessed soldiers who were preparing to meet death, putting their souls in order. It was a night of concentration and grim determination for people who knew that tomorrow might be their last day. The rain did not stop for a moment, continuing to wash away the ground that was soon to become a battlefield. English archers, sitting under raincoats, checked the feathers of their arrows and lubricated their bowstrings with grease. They knew that moisture was the main enemy of the bow, and did everything possible to keep their weapons dry. Every soldier understood that not only his own life depended on the condition of his equipment, but also the life of his comrade standing next to him. In this silence, a brotherhood was born, stronger than any feudal oath of allegiance. Henry V did not sleep, walking around the posts and talking personally with the sentries to keep their spirits up. He did not promise them mountains of gold or an easy victory. He spoke of duty, of brotherhood, and of the fact that England was watching them. The king allowed his men to express their fears, but in response he found words that turned fear into cold fury. He reminded them that the French had threatened to cut off 3 fingers of every captured archer so that they could never shoot again. This threat worked better than any patriotic speech, inspiring the soldiers to fight to the end. The ground beneath their feet turned into sticky mud, and experienced warriors understood that this could work to their advantage. Heavy knightly cavalry, the pride of France, would lose its main advantage on such terrain: speed and ramming power. Henry, who had a tactical mind, had already begun to piece together the puzzle of future victory in his head, using the terrain as an ally. He saw what the French, intoxicated with confidence, did not notice. The battlefield was too narrow for a huge army. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but it left behind a plowed, waterlogged field surrounded by dense forest. Fog spread across the lowlands, hiding the true scale of the French army, but the sound of thousands of hooves and the clang of armor left no doubt. The English were the first to assemble, taking up a defensive position and sticking pointed stakes in front of them. This was their only fortification, a fragile wooden wall against a steel avalanche. The French woke up later, with heavy heads and probably not in the best of spirits due to the dampness. They took a long time to form their battle lines, arguing about who would take the honorary vanguard. Due to the narrowness of the field, they had to form deep columns where the rear ranks hindered the front ones. None of them noticed that they had driven themselves into a giant funnel. The contrast between the two armies was striking. The sparkling gold and silver of the French coats of arms against the dirty rags of the English. But beneath those rags beat the hearts of men who had nowhere to retreat. The French saw easy prey before them, the English saw death, and it was this difference in perception that would prove decisive in the coming carnage. If you enjoy learning such details of history, don't forget to like this video. Guess how long it took to create the perfect conditions for disaster. The battlefield at Agincourt was a freshly ploughed strip of land, sandwiched between the forests of Tramecourt and Agincourt. The width of this area was only about 1,000 meters, and it narrowed toward the English side, forming a kind of bottleneck. For the French army, whose strength was estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000 men, this space was catastrophically small. They could not deploy their flanks and use their numerical superiority to encircle the enemy. The soil in this field was clayey, and after several days of continuous autumn rains, it turned into a deep, sticky swamp. Anyone who has ever walked across a plowed field after rain knows how your feet get stuck in the ground, making every movement painful.
By the saints, we are trapped.
Now imagine that you are wearing 30 kilograms of iron and sitting on a horse that is also clad in armor. Without knowing it, the French knights were preparing to attack in conditions that were the worst possible for cavalry. The English, on the other hand, took the most advantageous position in the narrowest part of the field, protecting their flanks with woods. Henry V positioned his men to make the most effective use of the limited space. In the center stood dismounted knights and men-at-arms, ready to take the brunt of the attack, while wedges of archers advanced on the flanks. This formation allowed them to crossfire any target that appeared in front of the army's front line.
This is not hope, but desperation.
The forest at the edges of the field was too dense for cavalry to pass through, which ruled out the possibility of a French flanking maneuver. This meant that the attack could only be head-on, directly at the prepared positions of the English. The French command saw this but disregarded the danger, relying on brute force and the power of their strike. They believed that their armored fist would simply sweep away the thin line of English defense, regardless of the terrain. Henry ordered his archers to do something else important. Each of them drove a long, pointed stake into the ground in front of them. These stakes, tilted toward the enemy, created an impenetrable palisade that the horses would crash into. It was a simple but ingenious engineering defense that could be set up in a matter of minutes. For the French cavalry, these stakes were an unpleasant surprise that could not be seen from a distance. The field was not just dirty, it was sticky like glue, and in places the mud was knee-deep. The French infantry and crossbowmen, who were supposed to start the battle, were pushed back because of the ambitions of the knights, who wanted to be the first to engage in combat. Because of this, the French army deprived itself of the support of its archers, voluntarily giving the initiative in long-range combat to the English. This was another fatal mistake in a series of miscalculations caused by pride. The English stood still for several hours, waiting for an attack. But the French were in no hurry, perhaps waiting for reinforcements or hoping that hunger would force the enemy to surrender. This wait played into the hands of the English, as the ground dried out a little, but everyone's nerves were on edge. Henry understood that they could not stand still for long. The men were cold and hungry, and their strength was waning. He needed to provoke the enemy into attacking, to force them to make a mistake. It was the geography of the battlefield that became the silent participant in the battle, determining its course. The narrowness of the space prevented the French from realizing their numerical superiority, turning their huge army into an unmanageable crowd. The mud deprived them of their maneuverability and speed, turning elite knights into slow targets. The forest protected the English from encirclement, allowing them to concentrate all their forces on a frontal attack. All these factors combined to create the perfect trap into which the French walked with their eyes wide open. They saw the field, they saw the mud, they saw the forest, but their arrogance prevented them from seeing the danger. They were convinced that the laws of physics and tactics did not apply to noble blood. But nature does not distinguish between titles, and mud holds a peasant and a duke equally. But the trap would have been useless without a tool to close it. What were the English armed with that made the hearts of the knights in armor tremble? The main hero of the Battle of Agincourt, apart from the king himself, was the English longbow, a weapon that became legendary. It was not just a curved piece of wood, but the pinnacle of engineering at the time, requiring enormous strength and skill. The bows were made of yew wood, and the craftsmen tried to use a piece of the trunk at the junction of the hard core and the flexible sapwood. This gave the weapon incredible elasticity and power, allowing it to send an arrow hundreds of meters with deadly force. The tension of such a combat bow reached 150 to 160 pounds, which is about 70 kilograms. Try to imagine that you need to lift an adult with one hand. This is exactly the effort that an archer exerted with each shot. To master this art, it was necessary to train from early childhood, literally deforming one's skeleton under the strain. Archaeologists find skeletons of English archers with curved spines and thickened bones in their left arms, which indicates superhuman exertion. The rate of fire of an experienced archer was phenomenal for that era. He could shoot up to 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Considering that there were about 5,000 archers on the battlefield, this meant that up to 50-60,000 arrows per minute could rain down on the French. It was a veritable shower of death from which it was impossible to hide or dodge. The sky literally turned black, and the roar of thousands of bowstrings and the whistling of arrows exerted tremendous psychological pressure. But it was not only the bows that mattered, but also the arrows used by the English. They used special needle-type arrowheads, known as bodkins. These were narrow, heavy, faceted tips made of hardened steel, designed specifically to pierce chain mail and find vulnerable spots in armor. Even if such an arrow did not pierce solid cuirass, it possessed enormous kinetic energy, capable of knocking a person off their feet or causing concussion. Even a non-fatal arrow wound to a horse caused the animal to panic and suffer uncontrollable pain. Wounded horses reared up, threw off their riders, and crashed into neighboring ranks, breaking formation. Against cavalry, the bow was a weapon of mass destruction, turning an organized attack into chaos. English archers knew that they had to shoot at the horses first in order to slow down the knights and deprive them of their mobility. It is important to note that archers were not knights. They were commoners, yeomen, free peasants. For the French nobility, it was an unthinkable insult to die at the hands of a peasant with a wooden stick. This class contempt also played a role. The French hated archers and sought to destroy them, forgetting to be cautious. But it was these peasants who turned out to be the most disciplined and deadly part of the English army. The archers were not positioned in a solid line, but in wedges, which allowed them to fire crossfire at the advancing columns. This created areas of continuous destruction, where arrows struck the enemy not only in the forehead, but also in the less protected sides. This tactic required iron discipline. They had to shoot in volleys on command, not at random. The archers' commanders directed the fire like conductors of an orchestra, directing clouds of arrows where they were most needed. Each archer had a supply of arrows stuck in the ground in front of him for quick reloading. When the arrows ran out, special bearers delivered new bundles from the supply trains. This battle logistics was fine-tuned to perfection, so that the flow of deadly metal would not dry up for a second. The English bow was a weapon that required not only strength, but also organization. Thus, on the field at Agincourt, there was not just a crowd of armed men, but a well-coordinated military machine. The longbow became the factor that negated the numerical superiority of the French. Technology and skill clashed with tradition and brute force, but even the best weapons are useless if the enemy does not attack. How did Henry force the French to march toward their doom? Are you ready for the shocking truth about how the battle began? The armies stood facing each other for several hours, and this waiting worked against the English. Henry realized that his men were weakening from hunger and cold, and decided to take an unprecedented risk to move his position forward.
It is a bold move indeed.
He ordered his archers to pull out their stakes, move several hundred meters closer to the enemy, and drive them back into the ground. It was a moment of incredible vulnerability. If the French had attacked at that moment, the English army would have been destroyed without resistance. But the French missed this opportunity, probably due to chaos in their command, or simply because they could not believe their eyes. The English took up a new position, now within direct bow-shot range, and rebuilt their defensive palisade. Finding himself within striking distance, Henry ordered the first volley to be fired to provoke the enemy. Thousands of arrows flew into the air and rained down on the French front lines, spreading panic and death. This bold move worked like a red rag to a bull. The French knights, enraged by the barrage, could wait no longer. Without waiting for a general order and without coordinating their actions, they rushed into the attack, eager to get to the insolent enemy as quickly as possible. The cavalry attack began spontaneously, without proper preparation, which immediately disrupted the order of the ranks. The earth shook from the pounding of thousands of hooves, and the French avalanche rolled forward. The first line of French knights, bowing their heads to protect their faces from arrows, plunged into the sticky mud of the field. The horses, having picked up speed, began to slip and stumble, losing momentum with every meter. The mud acted as a brake, slowing the attack and turning the gallop into a heavy, exhausting trot. The formation began to break down, the knights getting in each other's way, colliding sideways and piling up in a heap. English archers met the attack with a barrage of fire, aiming mainly at the horses, which were less protected than the riders. Wounded animals fell, creating living barricades that the rear ranks had to jump over. Riders who fell into the mud under the weight of their own armor often could not get up on their own and were trampled to death by their comrades. The attack faltered before it even reached the English positions. The few who did reach the English line encountered a palisade of stakes. The horses refused to go over the sharp wooden spikes, throwing their riders directly at the feet of the English infantry. Dismounted English knights and men-at-arms entered the fray, finishing off those who had managed to break through the wall of arrows. A fierce hand-to-hand battle ensued, in which those standing on the solid ground of the defenses had the advantage. Flanks of archers drove the French into the center, forcing them to huddle together in an even denser and more unmanageable mass. The knights, pressed on both sides, crushed their neighbors, preventing them from even raising their swords. This crush became more terrifying than any weapon. People suffocated and broke bones in their own crowd. French pride and valor sank into the mud and chaos. Despite the failure of the first wave, the second line of French cavalry and infantry continued to advance, unable to see what was happening ahead. They pressed down on those who were trying to retreat, creating a deadly traffic jam of people and horses. The fresh forces only exacerbated the situation, adding new victims to this cauldron of death. The French command completely lost control of the situation. Henry personally participated in the battle, fighting in the front ranks and inspiring his men by his personal example. The fiercest fighting raged around the king, and he was struck on the helmet with an axe, which knocked off part of his golden crown. But the English stood their ground, knowing that victory was closer than ever. They saw the great army of France destroying itself. The failed attack was only the beginning of the end for French knighthood, but the worst was yet to come, when the battle turned into a veritable slaughter. Want to know what happened in the center of this bloody mess? What happened in the center of the battlefield cannot be described as a battle. It was a stampede. The French infantry and dismounted knights advancing in the second wave collided with the retreating remnants of the first wave. The opposing flows of people mixed, forming a dense, immovable mass in which it was impossible to maneuver. People were pressed so tightly together that many died standing up, unable even to fall to the ground. The rear ranks, unable to see what was happening in front, continued to push forward, shoving those in front straight into the English swords. The pressure was enormous, and the French vanguard was literally crushed against the English formation. Knights who fell into the mud were instantly trampled by their own comrades, sinking deep into the slush under the weight of their armor. Many drowned in the mud without receiving a single scratch from enemy weapons. The English, standing freely, methodically killed those who were pushed towards them by the crowd, working like butchers. They did not need to look for the enemy. The enemies themselves fell on their blades under the pressure of the rear ranks. It was a methodical destruction of a helpless enemy who was held hostage by his own numbers. The mud and crowding made the French armor not a protection, but a trap that restricted movement. Mountains of corpses began to grow in front of the English formation, forming eerie ramparts as tall as a man. The English climbed these mountains of bodies to strike the heads of the still living French from above. The battle turned into a surreal scene where the living fought while standing on the dead. Blood mixed with mud, turning the field into a slippery red swamp. The French knights, accustomed to noble one-on-one duels, were unprepared for such a meat grinder. Their long spears and two-handed swords were useless in such close quarters, where it was impossible to even swing them. The English, on the other hand, used short swords, daggers, and war hammers, which were ideal for close combat. They struck at the gaps in the armor, the visors, and the armpits, finding vulnerable spots. The heat inside the armor, the lack of air, and physical exhaustion killed the French as surely as their weapons. Many lost consciousness from the stifling heat and fell, never to rise again. Panic began to spread through the rear ranks, who could hear the cries of the dying, but could neither help nor retreat. The French army turned into a giant organism devouring itself. The English archers, having shot all their arrows, threw down their bows, and also entered into hand-to-hand combat. Armed with axes, clubs, and knives, light and agile, they were terrifying to the unwieldy knights. They darted between the steel-clad giants, knocking them off their feet and finishing them off on the ground with misericordia daggers. It was a complete collapse of the social hierarchy. Peasants were slaughtering dukes like cattle. For the French nobility, such a death was the height of humiliation and disgrace, but they had no choice. The pride that had brought them to this field now became their tombstone. Chaos reigned supreme. Banners were nowhere to be seen. Orders were not heard. Everyone fought for themselves, trying simply to survive in this hell. By midday, the battle was effectively over, turning into a mopping-up operation and the capture of prisoners. The field was littered with thousands of bodies, among which lay the best men of France. The English, tired but alive, looked at the work of their hands with grim satisfaction. The battle had subsided, but the horrors of the day were not over yet. Ahead lay a decision that would cast a shadow over Henry V's reputation for centuries to come. By midday, the English had captured a huge number of prisoners, including princes of royal blood and the highest nobility. There were so many of them that the number of prisoners exceeded the number of Englishmen themselves. These were valuable trophies for which fabulous ransoms could be obtained, ensuring a comfortable life. The prisoners were disarmed but not tied up, as there were simply not enough ropes, and were seated in groups in the rear. Suddenly, a small detachment of local French marauders attacked the English rear, plundering the royal baggage train. At the same time, the remnants of the Third Corps of the French army appeared on the horizon, attempting to regroup. Henry V, assessing the situation, feared that the prisoners, seeing reinforcements, would revolt and attack from behind. He did not have enough men to guard thousands of knights and repel a new attack at the same time. And then the king gave an order that still causes controversy among historians and horror among descendants. He ordered the killing of all prisoners, except for the most senior figures, to protect himself from a blow from behind. The English knights refused to carry out this order, as it contradicted the code of honor and deprived them of their legal ransom. Killing an unarmed, surrendered nobleman was considered an unforgivable sin and a disgrace. Henry then entrusted this dirty work to a detachment of 200 archers under the command of one of his officers. Unbound by knightly vows and understanding the danger of the situation, they set to work. A methodical slaughter of unarmed people began, who just a minute ago had hoped for salvation. French nobles were killed with axes, their throats cut, and finished off with clubs right in front of their comrades. It was a scene of monstrous cruelty, violating all the rules of war of that time. The prisoners, encased in armor, could not resist and died like cattle in a slaughterhouse. Blood mixed with mud, and the cries of the dying drowned out all other sounds on the battlefield. It was a moment when the pragmatism of war finally triumphed over chivalric romanticism. The massacre only ended when it became clear that the French attack would not take place, and the threat had passed. But by that time, hundreds and possibly thousands of prisoners were already dead. The land of Agincourt absorbed not only the blood of enemies, but also the blood of those who had been promised life. This act by the king showed his ruthlessness and willingness to do anything for victory. The surviving French were shocked by what they saw, and their will to resist was completely broken. The Third French Corps, seeing the death of their comrades, left the battlefield without even entering the battle. Henry achieved his goal. He eliminated the threat and secured victory, albeit at the cost of a terrible crime. This episode became a dark stain on the shining armor of Henry V, but victors are not judged. At that moment, there was only one logic for him, the logic of his army's survival. History forgave him for this cruelty, calling it a military necessity, but did his contemporaries forget it? The battlefield finally fell silent, leaving behind mountains of corpses and questions with no answers. How much is a crown worth, and is there a place for honor when lives are at stake? When the smoke cleared, the scale of the French catastrophe became apparent and horrified even the victors. About 6,000 Frenchmen were left lying on the battlefield, and almost all of them were members of the nobility. In a single day, France lost its constable, admiral, several dukes, 90 counts, and 1,500 knights. It was the decapitation of a nation, the destruction of an entire generation of administrators and military leaders. English losses, according to various estimates, ranged from 100 to 500 men, which seems incredible given the scale of the battle. Among the dead were the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk, but the bulk of the army survived. Such a ratio of losses, 1 to 10 or even more, is unique in military history. It was not just a defeat, it was the complete annihilation of the enemy's military elite. Henry V toured the battlefield, which now rightfully belonged to him, and named it after the nearest castle, Agincourt. He ordered his dead to be buried with honors, while the French bodies were left in mass graves. The captured dukes and counts who had escaped the massacre were sent to England to become the king's living trophies. Their ransoms subsequently enriched the English treasury and allowed the war to continue. This victory made Henry VIII the most popular king in English history, a national hero. It legitimized his claim to the throne and silenced all his critics at home. France, meanwhile, was plunged into mourning and chaos, having lost its defenders and leaders. The road to further conquests was open. Agincourt became a symbol of the end of the era of chivalry, proving that infantry and archers could decide the outcome of wars. Shiny armor and pedigree no longer guaranteed victory and life on the battlefield. War was becoming a matter for professionals, where discipline was more important than personal valor. The English success was due not only to tactics, but also to fatal mistakes by the French command. Pride, disunity, and contempt for the enemy cost France dearly. It was a cruel lesson that showed that underestimating the enemy is the shortest path to defeat. The Battle of Agincourt went down in history as an example of spirit triumphing over strength, skill over numbers. It showed that even in the most hopeless situation, there is a chance of victory if you are prepared to fight to the end. However, despite the triumph, this victory did not bring an immediate end to the 100 Years' War. It only became its most vivid and bloody episode. England still had many years of struggle ahead of it to hold on to what it had conquered. But on that day, on the muddy field near Agincourt, the impossible became possible. The myth of the invincibility of French knighthood was trampled into the mud by English boots. After the victory, Henry's army, tired but inspired, finally reached Calais. The soldiers returned home as heroes, rich in trophies and glory. Every archer who survived this meat grinder felt equal to a knight. England welcomed its king with jubilation, church bells, and flowers. France, meanwhile, was on the verge of collapse, torn apart by civil war and foreign invasion. King Charles VI, suffering from insanity, was unable to rule the country. This led to the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, under which Henry VI became heir to the French throne. It seemed that Henry's lifelong goal had been achieved, and that the two crowns would soon be united. However, fate played a cruel joke. Henry died of dysentery just 7 years after his triumph, never becoming King of France. His conquests proved short-lived, and soon France, inspired by Joan of Arc, began to reclaim its lands. But the memory of Agincourt remained throughout the centuries as a reminder of the power of English weaponry. The longbow remained the dominant weapon on the battlefield for another century until it was replaced by firearms. But it was Agincourt that became its moment of glory, its highest point of fame. Never again did arrows decide the fate of kingdoms with such dramatic clarity. For us, this story is not just a list of dates and tactical schemes. It is a story about people, their fears, their courage, and their mistakes. It is a mirror that reflects all the cruelty and greatness of human nature. Agincourt teaches us that victory is forged not only on the battlefield, but also in the hearts of soldiers. That competent leadership and unity can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes even mud can be an ally, if you know how to use it. We look back through the centuries and see the faces of those who stood in that line in the rain. Their names are forgotten, but their feat lives on in every history textbook. They proved that the impossible is possible. As we conclude this story, it is worth considering. What would we have done in the place of those commanders? Would we have been able to see opportunity where others saw only doom? History gives us questions, the answers to which we must find ourselves. The story of the Battle of Agincourt is an eternal lesson in how overconfidence leads to ruin, while steadfastness and discipline can work wonders. 5,000 men doomed to death were able to destroy the cream of European knighthood thanks to clever tactics, use of the terrain, and new, deadly weapons. This battle showed that there are no trifles in war. Even the weather and soil type can be decisive factors in victory or defeat. Agincourt was a turning point that marked the decline of heavy cavalry and the rise of professional infantry. Write in the comments what impressed you most about this story. the effectiveness of the longbow, the fatal mistakes of the French, or Henry's cruel order to execute prisoners. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new exciting stories about the great battles of the past.